disease. There are also claims that with mixtures you can get various kinds of complementarity that will give you over-yielding relative to a single species alone. And that's very easy to demonstrate with mixtures of legumes and non-legumes in low nitrogen soil. But there are all these claims about, well, deep rooting mixed with shallow rooting and so on. And I've never seen actually a convincing case of that. The third situation is where you have partial overlap in time. And so by growing two species in essentially a relay crop where they overlap for part of their growth, you can exploit, more of the seasonal solar radiation and rainfall and so on. And so this is a nice examination of this. Each of these data points is a different mixture of two species, neither of which is a legume, so there are various, mostly grass family things, but I think there may be some others in there as well. And the yield gain from intercropping relative to a reference level of no benefit, plotted as a function of the difference in maturity between the crops. Now, if you had benefits from deeper and shallower rooting, higher and lower leaves, those kind of, phosphorus versus potassium or whatever, then you would see benefits, down here in cases where you had overlap in time, but you don't see any of that. It's only when you get beyond the 40-day overlap in the species that you start seeing a significant increase in benefit from growing these things as a relay crop. So this seems to be real, and the question is, is 15% enough to make it worth doing, having this kind of overlap? It depends on how you manage the crop and so on. But recently, the arguments for using mixtures in agriculture often rely on data from my colleague David Tillman, who a number of years ago planted plots with either one prairie species, two prairie species, up to 16 prairie species per plot. They put the same total seed weight per plot, so they weren't sort of biasing the system in that way. And then this is the biomass as a function of the number of species. And early in the experiment, there was a little bit of an increase when you went from one species up to two, and no significant increase above that. So a lot of intercrop, you only think about two species, so maybe that's good. But these benefits have apparently increased, and in 2000, the plots with 16 species not only had more biomass than the average one species plot, but they had more biomass than at least most of the better single species plots. So this seems like there may be some kind of complementarity that we could think about exploiting in agriculture. At least that's what I thought until I visited the Cedar Creek plots and took this picture of these single species plots. I said, well, gosh, there's an awful lot of bare soil here. Of course you have low biomass if you're only intercepting half of the solar radiation. That's kind of a problem. And so it seems to me that the key question is here, why is this, we know that monocultures can have complete canopy closure. We see that both in nature and in agriculture. So what's the deal here at Cedar Creek that this species is not able to fill in that space? And it seems like we really need to resolve that question before we can think about generalizing results from Cedar Creek more broadly. Here's another case where you very often see lots of bare soil, experiments done by advocates of intercropping to show the superiority of intercropping. And the way they do that is to plant their monoculture here at a very low density, giving low yield, and making the space which in the intercrop they can fill in with another species to give you high yield. So this is an example of the kind of error that nature cannot be fooled, the kind of error that we want to avoid. And if this diagram on the right from the famous article in Nature about rice intercropping in China is accurate, they actually have the same kind of error there, this big open space in the monoculture that could have been filled in with more rice plants, leading to an underestimate of the actual yield potential of the monoculture system. Somebody may know if this diagram is correct. Maybe it's true. The other thing I want to talk about is a kind of error to avoid. I think anybody who works in the field is familiar with the problem of edge effects, and you're typically, if you're getting yield from a small plot, you're not going to harvest the plants from the very outer row. But I'd like to suggest that things may be a little more complex or serious than could easily be addressed. And so this is another one of those aerial photos from our 1 acre or a half hectare plots at Eltras. And it looks like the edge effects are extending. This is a 70-meter plot, so it looks like the edge effects are extending 20 meters into the plot, something like that. On some of the sides, this is a case where you actually have a raised, slightly raised road, so there may be some runoff from the road going in there. That's certainly a problem that you could avoid if you've got a totally flat system. You could avoid that mechanism of edge effects. But we also see edge effects that go certainly a few meters into the edge on the other sides. So that's something to watch for. Colin Donald had this paper with this really cool graph where he had the R-squared correlation between the size of a corn plant and its neighbors. And so you had a strongly negative R-squared, that is, if you were next to a big plant, you were small. But then he went one step further and said, okay, how about the correlation between this plant and the one 2 plants removed? And there's a positive correlation because they were both next to this bigger neighbor and therefore were small. And then he went out one more step and there was this negative. And so this R-squared sort of oscillated positive and negative, gradually diminishing as you got further and further away. So I think we can think about that sort of thing happening as we move in from the edge of a plot and try to take that into account. This is an example. This is actually from an alfalfa yield trial at Davis, and they did what we're all supposed to do and should do, which is to have this yield area inside the plot, way away from the edges of the plot, so you don't have any edge effects. And of course, in harvesting this plot several times a year, because it was the yield area, they were very careful never to step on the yield area and break off the shoots that lead to the next regrowth. And as a result, they stepped very heavily on the area immediately around it. That area was visibly brown, sort of strip around the yield area, and created essentially an edge effect within the plot, even though the plot was plenty big enough overall. So this is a summary of today's talk. We want to avoid making promises that we can't deliver on, and will come back and bite us when funding sources say, gee, you promised you're going to do this. Where is it? Think about evolutionary trade-offs in analyzing what our results are and what they might mean, as well as perhaps in thinking about the projects that we tackle, the sorts of things that might be most likely to succeed. Any kind of claim that sounds too good to be true might in fact be too good to be true, and so it's good to have it tested by some independent party who wasn't involved in the original project. if we think about short-term results, I gave the example both of something which might increase phosphorus uptake in the short run, but not really increase the overall phosphorus availability over years or decades. That's something that would show up in a longer-term experiment. Or in the case of the advantages of intercropping, we really need to look at that over several years, not just a single-year experiment. And if we're doing it over several years, then we can compare with one of the alternatives being a crop rotation of the same species. You think about overall nutrient budgets in figuring out whether some particular approach to dealing with nitrogen shortage or phosphorus shortage is likely to be a long-lasting solution. And as I just mentioned, think about edge effects and what we have to do to avoid not just overestimates of yield resulting from edge effects, but the possibility that in some cases edge effects, say, involving interactions between two adjacent genotypes, might actually reverse the relative performance of those genotypes. So if they're highly competitive, they might actually not do very well when you have a whole field of them. I think that's it for today's lecture. And so now moving to the summary of the whole talk. I'm suggesting that natural selection is unlikely to have missed simple trade-off-free improvements, but there are probably many cases where trade-offs that are rejected by natural selection are in fact perfectly fine or even desirable in terms of our goals in agriculture. And because there are things that haven't been under selection, there may be a lot of low-hanging fruit, easy opportunities for us to make improvements through relatively simple genetic changes. I argue that natural ecosystems are not a good model for agriculture in terms of just copying their overall organization, but I do see natural ecosystems as a very valuable resource for agriculture for several reasons. One is the various kinds of ecosystem services that they may provide in terms of pollinators from a natural forest flying into an agricultural field, for example. And they are, while we can't assume that their organization, their diversity or spatial patterns or whatever, that those are optimal for agriculture, they do give us an opportunity to figure out how diversity or the degree of clumping of species or patterns of space and time, they give us a way that we can figure out what kind of patterns are going to maximize stability, productivity, resource use efficiency. In the same way that, if we want to improve our educational system, we could just say, well, Germany probably has a good educational system. Let's copy them in every respect. Or we could say, let's go look at a bunch of educational systems and copy the things that seem to be working well. That's the approach that I advocate with using the organization of natural ecosystems as a source of information for agriculture. And I argue that natural selection has given us all these really sophisticated adaptations in wild species. Some of those might be things that we might either transfer to crops through genetic engineering or through wide crosses, but there might be other cases where we look at it and go, okay, well, so wild potatoes, they have these trichomes, and if an aphid breaks the trichome releases aphid alarm pheromone, and the aphids fly away. Now, we might not be able to transfer that gene to rice, but is there any way that we can sort of adapt that overall strategy somehow to improving pest control in rice or maize or something like that? And so if the point is that if you just had a DNA sequence of potato, you would never have figured out from the DNA sequence that they have these trichomes that scare away aphids. And even if you had the potatoes growing in a glass house somewhere without the aphids, you wouldn't have figured that out probably. So if we're going to get ideas for improving crops from the adaptations of wild species, often we will have to study those wild species in the context where they evolved. So there's lots of reasons to preserve natural ecosystems, but that's another one to add to the list. I haven't really talked this much about the diversity. It's the last chapter of my book, and the kind of point I make there is that, you know, I don't really think that perennial grain crops are a very good idea. I don't really think that organic farming is going to be able to meet all of the world's food needs, but I think an agricultural system where we invest some resources in, you know, high risk, high possibly reward things like C4 rice or perennial grains, it would be foolish to, you know, put all of our resources into just one area. We ought to have that kind of diversity and maximize the chance of finding something really useful. And similarly, we don't necessarily need to cover the landscape with organic farms. They're 1% of U.S. land base, but I will bet that more than 1% of the good ideas for improving agriculture can be found on organic farms. So diversity in the field, diversity in research, I think that's what we want. And I'll close the series by thanking my funding sources. I've had grant funding from NSF almost continuously, mostly for work on nitrogen fixation. More recently, even though I'm in the Department of Ecology and Evolution, I've been supported by the experiment station system in Minnesota, helping them plan some long-term experiments. So I really appreciate that. And I really appreciate being invited here. I've been very impressed by what I've seen. And I would like to congratulate you for what you're doing and ask you to keep up the good work. Thanks.